Welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see a full house here this afternoon. Welcome to this Public Historians Association History Week event, No Place for a Woman. And we're lucky that the Melbourne Museum hosts us as they did last year. My name's Michelle Rayner. I'm part of ABC Radio National's weekly history program called Hindsight. But I'm with you today with my Public Historians Association member hat on. I'm very proud to be part of our dynamic association which is behind today's event. And this is the second year that we've run this event, which is wonderful too. And we're back due to popular demand. Working in radio, I shouldn't pop. Popular demand. We had such a fantastic turnout for the event last year, despite the motor show being on across the road at the same time last year. And we're looking again this year at really women in history. It's fascinating. We were talking out back about why this is a perennially in Australia, the fact that women seem to be, taken out of history, erased or elided, or simply forgotten. And it's interesting, our lineup today, again, I'm so shocked that I don't know these stories. So you're in for a treat. I should say I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that the museum's on, the Boon Wurrung and the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. So, no place for a woman. It's a sort of a rhetorical question, but someone actually said it, and we think it was a senior top-ranking bloke in khaki. And of course it's thrown down the gauntlet to us historians. We felt that we needed to tackle it again, the reason why women are somehow not written into our record, at least not until recent decades. There's been a big week thinking about the rise of second wave feminism and the role of people like Gough Whitlam in helping to champion that. So we're looking at women in history through the prism of a big anniversary that we've been marking this year, and that's of course World War I. And again, it's another gauntlet, isn't it? Women and war. And as you're about to hear, women have had a central place in war. They've had experiences shaped by war. They've been at the forefront. They've been involved in so many ways, in myriad ways. We've also been quite generous with the way in which we've approached the idea of war and conflict. So let's get cracking. No place for a woman. I keep wanting to put a question mark at the end of that. No place for a woman, as a challenge. And I think we actually did originally have no place for a woman with a question at the end. Our first speaker today is Dr. Claire Wright. Claire is the recipient, of the Stella Prize for her book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. Apparently her book has just been shortlisted in the Prime Minister's History Award, which is fantastic news. I also noticed on Thursday that it was longlisted, or part of the long shortlist for the Walkley Awards, Journalism Awards book category. Fantastic. And it's Eureka today where Claire has drawn her central subject from. The woman in question is Ellen Young, and she was the forgotten instigator of Eureka. I think she was the Ballarat poetess as well. Is that right, Claire? So please welcome Claire Wright.
When you think of the Eureka Stockade, an event you no doubt first learnt about in primary school as I did, it's likely that you conjure up images like this. Here you have the iconic Eureka flag, symbolic of the egalitarian, anti-authoritarian stirrings of Australian nationalism, surrounded by a circle of angry men. A ring of fiery indignation against an unjust system of taxation and a corrupt maladministration of the colony's ambitious and edgy gold rush population. You might recall from your school days that the man in the middle, standing on the stump, about to have his own arm reduced to a stump after he is shot at the stockade, is Peter Lalor. Peter Lalor, leader of the Ballarat miners. Peter Lalor, rebel. Peter Lalor, who would the following year be elected to Parliament and start his career as an illustrious Conservative and scab-employing mine owner with a famous federal electorate named after him. Peter Lalor, whose rallying cry at the monster meeting that day, the 29th of November 1854, is included in today's best-selling book, Well May We Say, The Speeches That Made Australia. Lalor is immortalised there as issuing a one-word speech: liberty. But it's unlikely, you know, that Lalor was paraphrasing the more inflammatory and prolix words of a Ballarat woman. In fact, if you have an image of women on the goldfields in mind, it is likely a picture of absence, a null space, a void. These are the so-called grass widows we also met in school, or as the artist William Strutt put it, the girls the diggers left behind. But women were present on the diggings in great numbers, and one of them was so well known that she proudly bestowed upon herself the moniker the Ballarat Poetess. Ellen Frances Young was born in Hampshire, England in 1810. By the time she sailed to Victoria in 1853 to join her husband Frederick at the Ballarat goldfields, Ellen Young was already a prolific drawing room poet and quite possibly an activist. Ellen and Frederick had been married at St James Church in Clerkenwell, a hotbed of Chartist unrest. Ellen, whose poetry reveals a classical education in literature, history and theology, as well as clear Chartist sympathies, may have been present at the great Chartist riots of the 1840s. A meeting on Clerkenwell Green set the stage for the great Kennington Common demonstration of 1848. But it was in Ballarat in 1854 that Young truly found her voice. In an age of Instagram and 24/7 selfies, it's hard to imagine, but there's no visual record of Young. This is a rare picture of one of Young's contemporaries at Ballarat, the equally awesome Sarah Hanmer. Now, Young's first poem appeared in the press on the 1st of June 1854, the first day of what was to be a wet, miserable winter of discontent on the diggings. Entitled Ballarat and published in the Geelong Advertiser, the poem is a 16-stanza commentary on the miserable living conditions and depressed emotions of a community crushed under the weight of high expectations and negligible outcomes. It begins ominously. If you've not been to Ballarat, then stay away from there. I would not have my worst foe's cat to have such sorry fare. Young goes on to describe the poor state of the roads, the lack of fresh food, the wet and the mud, the apocryphal gold, and the burdensome memories of times and places past. It's probable that you know this famous von Gerard, in fact painted 30 years after his time at Ballarat, and a whole lot rosier than his original sketches of the conditions in 1854, as we've just been seeing. Midstream, the poem begins to take on a more righteous air, taking moral offence at the insult of the situation. The floods were out, the mailmen drunk, what matter the delay? That though their hearts of many sank, they're diggers, who are they? They're men, high-taxed, ill-lodged, worst fed, of strong and stalwart fame. Better was near a hero led, or earned a hero's name. Now, Young wrote this poem from her tent on Golden Point during the flood, and this is a picture of a sly grog cellar in a tent like the one that Ellen would have lived in, but I'm not suggesting that Ellen, in fact, sold sly grog. She later recalled that she moved her mattress to dry ground, then her spleen evaporated into her first truly political poem. With these words in print, Young introduced a new element into public discourse about the diggings, a sense of grievance, an air of affront, a polarising of the forces of good and evil through the positioning of heroes against villains. It was a position that would be increasingly taken up by other organs of public opinion by the spring of 1854. But Young wasn't content with mere poetry and letters to the editor of the local paper, the Ballarat Times. She had sufficient self-belief and community authority to take her views all the way to the top. In September, she wrote to Governor Hotham proposing an alternative taxation system to replace the hated licence fee and placate the restless goldfields population. When her plan to bring about an improved order of affairs fell on deaf ears, she again wrote to the Ballarat Times, but now with the fury of a woman scorned. Justice must be awarded to the universal demand of an indignant people. Oh, Sir Charles, we had better hopes of you. We, the people, demand cheap land, just magistrates to be represented in the Legislative Council, in fact, treated as the free subjects of a great nation. In other words, liberty. Ellen Frances Young signed her letters in the fashion of the times, your obedient servant. She was nothing of the sort. Her radical departure from feminine rectitude not only mirrored, but ultimately influenced the rebellious spirit of the age. Was Young's tongue in her cheek or her finger in the air when she added to her letter, "Is there not one man, Mr. Editor, to insist on the above demands?" So, you might not find her name in any school curriculum, but the fact is that Ellen Young stuck her hand up much earlier and her neck out much further than any man in the campaign for popular rights and civil liberties on the Victorian goldfields. Eureka was Ellen's place, and she knew it.
Thanks, Claire. Where were you when I was dragged through Year 9 Australian history, which was included the goldfields? I think I got a much more dramatic 8-minute taste of the real drama that took place at that time than the whole of 12 months of Australian history. And this is what we mean by active history. You know, this is what this event can do and epitomises. It brings history to life. So, our next speaker in this No Place for a Woman event is Catherine Tiernan. Now, Catherine was at pains earlier on to make sure that I wasn't overemphasising the term women in this, which I clearly banged on about in the intro. But we've been very generous with the term woman as well, or women. And you'll understand why when Catherine gives her talk. I think there's a sort of a notion too around the idea that the idea of woman and conflict is a sort of a dissonance. Well, Catherine's talk is going to play with that to some extent. In the theatre of war, there was a performer called Lindsay Kemble in World War I. Lindsay, though, was probably better known by her stage name, Mamselle Mimi. And Lindsay is our subject now. Catherine.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. So wrote William Shakespeare, author of tragedies and comedies, and no stranger to the topic of war. There were many parts to play in the great tragedy of World War I, as labourers, clerks and engineers took on their roles as soldiers in the front line. cooks, signallers or officers in command, women took part in the depleted workforce, raised funds, knitted socks, nursed the wounded, and the list goes on. When we think of this war and remember the many ways men and women played their parts, for good reason our minds turn to the drama of events as they unfolded. However, there was another side, perhaps surprisingly, a place for comedy, and a valuable role for Lindsay Kemble to play in this theatre of war. In 1916, Australia's active involvement in the war dragged on into its second year. The Army recognised the importance of boosting soldiers' morale, and, as vaudeville had been popular before the war, theatrical troupes of diggers were formally established to perform songs, skits, and variety items for the diggers. These concert parties reminded soldiers of the relatively carefree nature of their lives before the war, the home lives they were fighting to preserve. And humour proved an effective, if somewhat temporary, psychological antidote to the grim realities of life at the front. The value of these concert parties was so widely recognised, Aussie, the Australian Soldiers magazine, claimed,
"Field vaudeville theatres are something more than a luxury. They are a necessity."
These digger troops performed in barns, halls and hospitals, often close to the battle lines, and crowds of all ranks flocked to their makeshift theatres. A member of the theatrical troupe, the Sentimental Blokes, described the scene.
The soldiers used to wait hours outside in the cold and rain. Then there would be a fight to get in, and they would pack in tightly.
Very tightly, it seems, as they are reported to have performed to about 800 soldiers every night. But providing this entertainment was not without risk. This barn in the Somme, used as a theatre and soldiers' billet, suffered 2 direct hits one night, killing 27 and wounding 60 others. This was arguably no place for a woman. And yet, if entertainment was to remind the men of home and of what life could be like, what better than a woman to remind them? Fortunately for the Sentimental Blokes, there was a vaudeville artist in France by the name of Lindsay Kemble, who was set to become the company's star attraction. Prior to the war, Australian theatrical producers had clamoured to secure for their theatres this rather pretty dancer with an excellent vaudeville voice. Audiences had packed overcrowded theatres, but there was more to Lindsay than met the eye. This popular artist had initially achieved fame, or rather notoriety, by deceiving much of Adelaide for almost 2 months. The headlines tell the tale. Lindsay maintained that this deception was the result of a bet, in which he undertook that he could pass as a woman for 2 months without being detected. However, detected he was, 3 days short of winning his £100 bet. Lindsay's cross-dressing may have been indicative of a gender preference, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the public masquerade. Either way, he was let off with a fine and within days had become a household name. Reporters wrote glowing reviews about the now famous Lindsay Kemble, who played back-to-back performances to full houses and featured in the film Lindsay Kemble's Adelaide Escapades. Lindsay continued touring throughout 1915, but in September 1916 he enlisted in the AIF under the name of Victor Kemble. After a year in the battlefields, fighting as a bomber in the 4th Light Trench Mortar Battery, Lindsay was taken out of the line to perform with the Sentimental Blokes. This was a win-win for Lindsay and the Blokes. As the Argus reported, no company of soldier entertainers was complete without its female impersonator. The Smart Set had 4. But according to Aussie Soldiers magazine, Kemble was the best. They reported, "Their trump card is the girl. She's a dear. Ozzy has seen a lot of girls, not nearly so girlish as Private Victor Kemble's impersonation. Girlish girl or not, Lindsay had spent plenty of time in the fighting front and as a performer was still at risk. Once buried in the middle of a performance, he explained,
We were always up in the forward area and gave our performances under fire. They used to get us with gas. All of us had been gassed.
The writings of countless soldiers indicate that, theatrical talents aside, it was shared war experience, which no woman could have, that enabled these digger actors to so successfully connect with their audiences. At war's end, the sentimental blokes remained in Britain and Europe, entertaining the troops that were still required for end-of-war peacekeeping and security measures. And they performed more than once for the Prince of Wales. Lindsay arrived home at the end of 1919, having arguably achieved a more acceptable form of fame.
Every member of the AIF knows the female impersonations of Mr. Lindsay Kemble. They were an institution in the AIF in France, and they cheered up and kept in good heart thousands of diggers.
Lindsay was one of 7 actors from former field theatre groups who then created the All Digger Company. The Diggers were a highly collaborative troupe of players who wrote their scripts and performed for returned servicemen, civilians, state, community and military leaders throughout Australia and New Zealand during the 1920s. They wrote shows that offered audiences something typical of their performances and life at the front, including their musical comedy of the war, Mademoiselle Mimi, with Lindsay in the title role. Dubbed their misleading lady and the greatest female impersonator of modern times, Lindsay was popular with men and women alike, and audiences loved the show.
His Majesty's has not been so crowded, nor has resounded to such tumultuous applause and cheering as it did last night, when the All Diggers appeared in Mademoiselle Mimi.
But the Diggers didn't always play for laughs. Lindsay and his troupe also attempted to communicate the darker side of the war experience. Describing a tableau from Mademoiselle Mimi entitled Going into No Man's Land, one of the troupe explained,
It was arranged to give atmosphere, to recall for a moment the real thing. We make it short because it tends to recall sad memories, but we want the diggers to be able to say when they see it, there you are. I've been trying to explain to you for weeks how we used to do it. Now you see.
So, after creating a welcome respite for men immersed in the horrors of war, Lindsay and his troupe recreated as no others could both humorous and dramatised episodes for a broad audience at home. These performances were arguably cathartic, as they allowed returned men to relive their time at the front in a supportive environment. They shed light on the war experience for families and the wider community, and they encouraged a dialogue, countering the common post-war tendency to not talk about the war. In these ways, Lindsay and the All Diggers helped veterans and their families negotiate the difficult but essential path between acknowledging what had happened and moving on. It may seem easy to dismiss the idea of any vaudeville entertainer, particularly a female impersonator, playing a valuable role in the well-being of a nation's soldiers. But there was a vital place for comedy in this great tragedy, and worthwhile parts for all kinds of players, even, or perhaps especially, for Lindsay Kemble.
Thanks, Catherine. Revealing and quite poignant on many levels too, and I think a prism, an insight into World War I that you wouldn't get in many other places. Fascinating story of Lindsay Kemble and Mademoiselle Mimi. Our next speaker is PHA member Alicia Alicia Cerrito. Alicia has uncovered a story of one woman's experience of World War II. And this is a story which has real resonance, sort of a disturbing resonance actually, for contemporary Australia, the Australia that we're living in now, around the issue of refugees and others fleeing conflict and danger. The German emigre, Alice Meyer von Forel, was described as, this is a quote, one of the most dangerous aliens interned in Australia during the Second World War. Alicia takes us back to wartime Australia and the events which led to this claim. Alicia.
At first glance, you might think that Alice Meyer von Forel looks quite traditional. Here she is in her chiffon gown with her decorative wallpaper and her ornate chairs. Her hand is being kissed by her husband, who is wearing a carnation in his buttonhole. Throughout her life, Alice supported her husband, was a stickler for etiquette, taught people to curtsy for the Queen, and was an accomplished dancer. Her skill for diplomacy and her ability to host a party saw her taking on a role as the consul for Venezuela here in Melbourne in the late 1970s. So why did I choose Alice for the topic of No Place for a Woman? Well, a large portion of her life was spent trying to find a place. After fleeing the Nazis in Germany, being unemployed in England, and being unable to afford an opportunity to run a dance school in Egypt, Alice and her husband, Hans Joachim Meyer, made their way to Australia. Hans's Jewish heritage had meant that staying in Germany was impossible, and Alice was told that if she wanted to continue running the dance school he had started, that she would have to divorce her husband. But here in Australia, at the outbreak of the Second World War, instead of being seen as genuine refugees, Alice and Hans were arrested, imprisoned, interned, and investigated. When she arrived in Sydney in 1938, Alice Meyer von Forel and her husband had made a splash in the social pages. As their ship stopped in Fremantle and Melbourne, the press reported on their arrival and exclaimed with excitement over the new European dancers Alice and Hans would bring to our shores. With her husband, Alice opened a dance school, taught German, perhaps not a wise move in 1938, and held parties at their flat in Potts Point. They had a regular engagement performing exhibition dances and hosting guests at parties like these at the Hotel Australia, the place to be. In Sydney, it seemed Alice had found a place. But early on the morning of the 4th of September 1939, Alice and Hans were arrested as enemy aliens. They were shocked to see the police on their doorstep and made phone calls to their friends only to find that there was nothing to be done. In what was later called a malicious whispering campaign, Alice and her husband were denounced as paid agents and called
the most dangerous aliens interned in Australia.
Suspicions against Alice were that she seemed to be thoroughly German, and a very cunning woman. Alice and Hans were held in separate prisons and sent to different internment camps in New South Wales. These pictures give you an idea of what it was like. Back in Sydney, their letters and bank accounts were scrutinised, their friends and acquaintances were interviewed, and rumours abounded about their loyalty and reasons for coming to Australia. After 5 months in detention, Alice and Hans were released and reunited. The authorities determined
nothing has been proved against these people, the case resting largely on suspicion.
The case resting largely on suspicion. It emerged that those who had informed on the Myers were jealous of the couple's luxurious flat, their friends in high places, and their quick success in Australia. The Deputy Director of Security's report about Alice read,
Doubtful whether likely to make a reliable citizen after cessation of hostilities.
and
That she be recorded on Security Blacklist B as a permanent security risk.
the Myers' release was granted, but on the condition that they reside no closer than 100 miles from the coast. So they found themselves living rough in a shearer's cottage on a farm just out of Wagga, a remote and tough life. But only a few months later, Hans was reinterned. Alice wrote many letters to both government and military authorities appealing Hans's internment. For the most part, it is through these letters that we are able to hear her voice.
Nobody can realize here what we and many of us have already suffered at the hands of Hitler's oppression. Please do free my husband and send him back. I will not be able to live in the lonely cottage and do all the work required on my own. If you have to detain my husband for any length of time, please do give me permission to go and see him. I feel I do need him in this time of distress by my side, just as he will need me. There is already so much hardship in this world, and one should mitigate it whenever it is possible.
When Hans was transferred to the Tatura internment camp in Victoria, Alice moved to Melbourne to be closer to him and took any job she could, first as a lady's maid and then as a secretary for an engineering company. Hans was later moved to the Loveday internment camp in South Australia, and any hope Alice had of visiting Hans was dashed. In 1944, Hans was finally released. By this time, Alice had secured a place for them to live in Hawthorn, and this was where her husband joined her to re-establish their dance school and their lives. Their advertisement lists not only ballroom dancing, but also gymnastics, deportment, poise, classes in the art of walking, and for debutantes. In this photo, Alice is just about to resign her post as consul for Venezuela in 1980. She was interviewed by The Age at the time and bemoaned the lack of decorum in the modern world, saying, "Debutantes? Now they want them trained for a floor show." Behind her is her Great Dane, Caesar. He was a much pampered member of the family who was taken into the city for trips, walked down Collins Street, and even offered ice cream by waiters. Alice made provision for him in her will to ensure that he was always taken care of. Alice lived in her Hawthorn house until she died in 1999. Hans had died 20 years before, and Alice never accepted another invitation to dance after his death. In this photo, she is wearing Hans's monocle. After she died, a wealthy woman, much of Alice's estate was shared between the charities that she had supported throughout her life. Despite everything that had happened during the war, as early as 1946, Alice was hosting fundraisers. I found record for one for the Lord Mayor's Food for Britain appeal. Today, there is still a fund in her name, managed by the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. Alice fought for her place. She survived having no place almost the world over, faced prejudice, poverty, and xenophobia, and eventually she thrived, becoming a Melbourne identity and, I think we would say, a reliable citizen. Today we have heard the story of Alice, a philanthropist, a diplomat, and a teacher. A woman whose life is thriller, romance, and adventure story, all rolled into one.
How wonderful. This happened last year. I want to meet all of these subjects, all of the women, and of course Lindsay Kemble, the female impersonator. It's a real testament to this exercise of putting women and female impersonators, back in the historical public historical record. And I would have liked to have met, I think, the subject of our final speaker's talk today, although I have a sense from my brief foray into this subject story that she wasn't an exactly charming, personable kind of woman, and she didn't suffer fools gladly. Our final speaker today, Dr. Rachel Buchanan, is an historian and journalist and the author of Stop Press, The Last Days of Newspapers. And Rachel's also created her own limited edition newspaper, The Sirius, which I saw earlier this year when it came out. Terrific. So it's not surprising that the subject that I've just alluded to has piqued Rachel's interest, and she's uncovered the story of the journalist, sexual health campaigner, and polymath really, Etty Rout. What a name. She's going to be someone worth hearing about with that name alone. And Etty was as brave as any slouch-hatted infantryman. She waged her own really hard, arduous battle during World War I, and it was around a subject that was really hard to talk about, taboo in fact at the time. Rachel Buchanan.
In World War I, a soldier's bedroom was no place for a woman unless she was a wife or a whore. Tasmanian-born, New Zealand-raised Etty Rout was neither of these things. Yet she occupied the brothels of Europe. She waged a one-woman war for sexual health. Her weapons were the Franger, the French letter, and the Hercules sheath. Her acid tongue helped too. Her enemy was the military hierarchy and polite society, the rules that made women and men afraid of sex and kept them ignorant about it. I want people to have more sexual intercourse and have it safely and happily, she would tell her friend, the writer H.G. Wells. Who was this bold woman who refused to know her place? This unsettling passport snap, taken in 1918, gives some clues. Etty is 41 here, unmarried and childless. She is a woman with every hair out of place. Her mouth turns down in a wry smile, her eyes are clear, blue, haunted, wide open. Her face is half in shadow, half in light, a perfect illustration of the extreme responses she would soon provoke. She was called a devil, an angel, a shrew. Yet I think of her as a dreadnought. A dreadnought is a battleship, but my Macquarie tells me it's also a noun for one who fears nothing. Rout was a journalist, a cyclist, a socialist, a unionist. She set up the New Zealand Volunteer Sisterhood during the Gallipoli campaign. She recruited women aged between 30 and 50 to go to Europe and care for soldiers. The government was opposed to her plan. She ignored them. She sent her first team of sisters to Cairo in October 1915, just as men were being evacuated from the Gallipoli Peninsula were arriving in the city too. The sisters worked at the YMCA canteen at Esbekia Gardens in the heart of the city's red light district. Here they are, ready to leave. Etty is the slight, serious, hatless figure in the centre. It's the only photo I've seen where she's with a group of women. Etty got to Egypt in 1916 and opened the Tel El-Kabir Soldiers Club and Canteen to care for Anzac troops fighting in the Sinai and Palestine. She worked 12-hour days, mixing puddings in bathtubs and making cocoa in tureens. But this was Etty's preferred place. She loved being one of the boys, a lanky woman at the centre of a gang of men. She's the figure in the centre with a rose pinned on her jacket, I think. This image was taken after the war in Villa Bretonneux in the Somme. Etty set up the Soldiers Club, and from 1919 to 1920, she also ran the Red Cross depot there, feeding more than 200 children a day. The French government gave her the Reconnaissance Française Medal for this work and for her sexual health campaign. For it was condoms, not custard, that earned Etty the title of Guardian Angel of the Anzacs. The American Army's Social Hygiene Division made posters such as these to warn soldiers of the risk. It's easy to snigger, and I did, but the dangers were real. In Egypt, randy Anzacs were being infected at 6 times the rate of British troops. Most of the 20,000 women working as prostitutes in Cairo were infected with VD, and they serviced up to 30 men a night. At Sling Camp, Wiltshire, one soldier said there were several 100,000 Anzacs and 36,000 prostitutes. In Paris, there were 70,000 Joy Girls. Do the sums. The Red Plague spread like wildfire. It was an epidemic. By late 1915, at least 10,000 Australasians were infected. By 1916, 9,000 more men had the clap. Etty was completely outraged. She saw that there were more Anzac casualties of war in VD wards than on the front. It's enough to make an archangel molt, as Rout liked to say when she was cross. She just had the best one-liners ever. Infected men would infect their women. Evocative American posters like this one exhorted troops to remember their loved ones and take care in the sack. The Americans set up prophylactic stations at every base. Australia and New Zealand, initially at least, did nothing. Etty went to England to research a prophylactic kit that could prevent syphilis and gonorrhea. "You need not apologise for talking plainly," Etty told one expert whose advice she sought. "I have been inoculated against all moral shock." She's just not believing. VD could make men and women sterile. It could turn them insane. If an infected woman got pregnant, her child could also be harmed. As this poster said, the disease was a mortgage on mind and body. Worried parents wrote to Rout, begging her to save their sons. Many said abstinence was the thing. In 1917, the Australian government hired a chaplain to lecture the troops on the benefits of self-control. The sermons were probably worse than useless, Charles Bean later admitted. The truth was, soldiers were hungry for intimacy. They would have sex, no matter what anyone said. As Rout's biographer Jane Tollerton puts it, Etty saw venereal disease as a medical issue rather than a moral one. Cock-ups were inevitable. Vice could be nice, but sex must be safe. As we can see in this photo, taken in 1918, Etty enjoyed a warm rapport with troops. She's playing cards with Anzacs on leave in Paris. Men such as these hailed her as beloved, a gallant being, a dear soul, a legend. A platonic love affair, Tollerton hailed the soldiers' relationship with Rout. In public, though, Rout was ostracised. This person, I cannot say lady, is highly objectionable in every way, said Colonel Parks, the Deputy Director of New Zealand's Medical Services. In the House of Lords, a bishop called Rout the most wicked woman in the world. I walk into a room and nice people turn their backs, Rout said. New Zealand Cabinet used war regulations to ban any mention of her from newspapers. The letters she typed to the editor were never published. Her biggest critics were other women. They believed Rout was corrupting their men. Even members of her volunteer sisterhood protested against her. The mothers and women generally of the country would tear her to pieces if they could get her hands on her, one soldier recalled. Yet by the end of 1917, the New Zealand Army was quietly giving troops on leave the prophylactic kits she had designed. They contained a condom, calomel ointment to be rubbed on the genitals before sex, and a packet of dissolving purple crystals for washing yourself afterwards. Army chiefs also gave tacit approval for the inspected brothel Rout set up on her own in 1918. Before long, New Zealand had the lowest rate of VD of any troops in Paris, yet the Army never acknowledged how many men she saved. Her work was hushed up and eventually forgotten. But the Anzacs remembered the tall, lean woman who called out to them as they arrived at Gare du Nord, Paris, ready for some leave. Rout stood on the platform in a khaki jacket and slouch hat adorned with the Australian rising sun. She kissed each man on the cheek and handed him this card with an address on one side. Madame Yvonne's house made safe and suitable provision for the sexual needs of troops, it said. Madame's girls got cards too. Remember that if you have the disease, not only are you doing yourself serious harm by delaying treatment, but you are helping the enemy by rendering our men unfit to fight. Oh. What a babe. This is Etty Rout, aged 34 in 1911. She was almost 6 foot tall and superbly fit, with what her lover and later husband, Fred Hornibrook, would describe as a Venus de Milo body type. And his nickname was actually Horny. I mean, these people were real. After the war, Rout continued fighting for sexual freedom. She chose this photo of herself for the frontispiece of Sex and Exercise, her 1925 study of the sex function in women, one of several books she wrote on this theme. And she was a pioneer of pelvic floor exercises. It was amazing. She believed that native belly dancing was the thing for women who wanted to stay slim, remain regular, and enjoy sex. Like the passport photo, though, this image exposes a woman at war with herself. Rout's body is ripe and beautiful. Her top half is open and relaxed, and she holds her hands behind her head, striking the pose of a pin-up. Yet her legs are firmly crossed, her smile is forced, and her eyes, while dreamy, are also challenging. What is wanted now is that a woman stands to her guns and fires for all she is worth, Etty told an equal pay meeting in 1904. She did this. She fought and fired, never giving up, until she found herself in a no man's land, a chaotic stretch that lay between the army of men and the army of women. Etty no longer had a public life, yet she had no private one either. She occupied the only place left to her, the territory of the outcast. It's a mixed blessing to be born too soon, she said to H.G. Wells in 1922. Rout died in Rarotonga in 1936 from a self-administered dose of quinine. She even wrote her own epitaph. Etty died at sea, the telegram said. No place for a woman, but a good resting place for Rout, a most noble dreadnought, the goddess of safe sex. Thank you.
Can't you see a feature film in Etty? And it's such a huge, it's almost larger than history. It has a sort of a fictional quality to it, but it all happened. They, as Rachel said, these people were real. Well, from the battle lines under the Southern Cross more than 150 years ago to the no man's land that was the sexually transmitted disease frontier during the Great War, this has been nothing if not an historical panorama. And no place for a woman, indeed. Well, as per last year, to round this event off, we've invited a special guest to reflect on some of the wider themes that have emerged today across the 4 talks from our members, our historian members. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Kaz Cooke, the writer and cartoonist Kaz Cooke. And I feel like Kaz has been sort of part of my life, my adult life. She was there in the 80s when I was struggling, I think, as sort of emerging into an emerging professional career. And one of those young women who proudly called myself a feminist. Her pithy, sharp, deliciously humorous exposés in her cartoons of the sort of inherent sexism that exists in Australia, from the workplace to the home front, was like a lifeline. It was a tonic and a salvo. So let me introduce Kaz. She's been out the back rather than sitting down with you because she's got a back problem. Kaz.
Hello. Oh, look, I've been lurking out there. I was going to lie down on some bubble wrap, but I thought it might create a kind of a fusillade noise. Well, what a bunch of naughty hoydens. Look at them. Wow. I'm among some very coruscating company today. It's a bit mortifying. Apparently I am also here in a group of professional historians, and I am nothing but an amateur. So I feel like I've turned up for a netball game, but I'm wearing a snorkel, a mask and a scuba diving outfit. I'm game to strap on the wing attack bib anyway and have a crack, but just try not to stare at my flippers. Talk about war and women, they said, the theme of No Place for a Woman. And I feel sad. I'm actually going to make everybody show their slides again because I missed them all and I have no audio visuals. But I have been working for the past few months on a creative fellowship at the State Library, looking at objects and pictures of what people wear to show their allegiance or to say who they are. And there will be an exhibition on the 5th floor of the library by the end of this coming week. And one of the first things I found myself looking at, trying to find material for this exhibition, was a silver metal brooch. It was one of far too many that were posted to every mother in Australia who had a serving son in World War I. It was sent with an official letter to each woman saying, "Issued by the Department of Defence to the women of Australia for duty done." Good on you, breeders. These brooches had a bar attached below the medallion, and for each son who died in the war, you got a star placed on that little bar. There's enough room on each brooch for 5 dead sons. The silver medallion in the library collection has 2 stars on it. The 2 stars represent Geoffrey and Guy Berry, who were both killed in France in 1917. And the only thing we know about their mother is that she lost them and that her name was recorded as Mrs. Berry. I've heard from some people that in their families, the stories come down that their mothers had a very different reaction to receiving the brooches. One threw hers straight in the bin and another one never appeared without hers. As with so many women's stories, these are largely lost to us now, and it's hard to track women in history. They're rarely accorded much space or even their own names, and I'm sure that everybody here has had a tantrum in one of those cul-de-sacs where a woman disappears. I've been researching a novel set in the 1880s, more recently, trawling through the Trove and Papers Past websites, and I've found all the best information in organs that no longer exist. Small town and regional newspapers, sharp, gleeful reports in the Salacious Truth newspapers of both New Zealand and Australia, as well as the allegedly respectable papers of record, usually owned at the time by the sort of pompous old biffer in a top hat, but mostly written by the sort of upstart with a barista's beard. His identity hidden under Our Correspondent. His modern counterpart, you will all know, he tends to lope around the internet using the name Snazzledude47 or something similar. Now we have more women's stories to tell, but far fewer official places in which to tell them. What are the historians of the future going to read to know the stories of women today? Among many stories not being written, even in blogs or web forums, are the contemporary stories about women in war. And it was Rachel Buchanan who advised me to read James Brown's thoughtful book, Anzac's Long Shadow. I was more excited than I might have been because I thought it was actually James Brown, the godfather of soul. However, one of the other shocks in that book for me was that there has been no official history commissioned of the East Timor, the Afghanistan or Iraq military operations and wars. And the Defence Department and Defence Ministers disallow almost all reporting of what our armed forces are getting up to. So it's now a truism that the Australian public doesn't know what their defence forces are doing, but they really want them to stop doing it. This means that at the exact same time that women are joining our defence forces in increasing numbers, and they're now making up a little over 1/4 of Army officers, we know next to nothing about them or what they do when they go to work. We don't know whether to be proud of them or a bit scared of them. And it can't help when the most high-profile woman who used to be in the Army is Jackie Lambie. It would be like introducing yourself at a party and saying, oh, yes, no, hello, I'm an author. And they go, oh, yeah, like Shane Warne. Yeah, like that. The reporting of the military, when it does happen, focuses on government announcements, mostly by men. Any footage of Australian service people usually involves the exciting stuff, male combat troops in camouflage, a crucial but relatively small part of a modern army. This is not a peacetime Australia that we're living in. It just feels that way to most of us. And the reality is that there is now an official place for women in war, but most of us have no idea what it looks like. We're not hearing, for example, about the women who are leading strategy and logistics, the thinkers, the leaders in their field as surgeons, pilots of aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars, women in charge of infrastructure and maintenance, anticipating computer code, those who are Navy scuba divers, cooks, tactical weather experts or infantry soldiers. And within 2 years, women will be fully integrated combat troops in Australia. Will we hear from them? What's it like to train for 7 years and work for an honours degree in literature and history which examines the effect of community engagement on eradicating racist attitudes, only to turn up to that same party and be asked, what do you do? And you say, well, you know that once you give the answer, the next question will probably be, why do you want to kill people? And what's it like to be told you're a target for terrorists if you wear your work uniform? We're about to be bombarded with the stories of sacrifices and the blunders and the bravery of 100 years ago, and I hope that it doesn't blind us to the full range of triumphs, commitments and mistakes of the present and the recent past. Historians in the future will need documentaries and memoirs and letters and even comedy shows that touch on these people and these issues to tell them who we were and what we did. I don't think that we should condemn the historian of the future to the hideous task of searching 2004 and finding more comments and tweets about the besequent idiocy on Dancing with the Stars than about what women in the military are up to. And the thing is, I have a horse in the race now. To the surprise of all of us, perhaps even herself, my 16-year-old daughter wants to become an army officer. She wants to be on the right side of history. She wants to help people. She wants to protect and serve and be part of a global strategy that makes other parts of the world as safe as Australia. And in lieu of being unable to keep her locked in the laundry until she's about 32, and I've made all the jokes that I can think of about how the Air Force uniform is so much nicer than the khaki one, I'm going to have to try and understand what her life is going to be like. Already we've both been confronted with the reactions of people who make the fatuous assumption that wanting to be in the army means you just want to use devices that go bang, or the people who think that knowing about war means you automatically glorify it. And there's something I didn't realise as a young woman in the 1980s, because I was too busy getting a poodle perm mullet cut, and I was quite drunk a lot of the time. But it turns out that achieving equal rights for women wasn't inevitable or even a universal goal that everybody was working on together, because it was obviously quite a magnificent idea. It turns out that for every advance for women, there's staunch opposition and sometimes defeat and a regrouping and a re-strategising. And if you'll excuse the metaphor that breaks down right about here, sometimes we have to take the same ground over and over. In the second decade of the 21st century, when the Prime Minister calls the only woman in his cabinet a loyal girl, and the Finance Minister thinks girly man is an amusing insult, wow, do we need to keep shining the light on what real women do? It's exhausting. But yes, apparently we do still have to keep saying and demonstrating that men, given the right opportunity, can be as brave and as professional and as clever and determined and as compassionate and flawed and nurturing and strong and as vulnerable as women can be. And to tell you the truth, I can't really bear to even let myself think about what it was like for Mrs. Berry to sit down at her kitchen table and open an unexpected parcel from the Defence Department to mark the death of her 2 boys. In my own self-centred ex-journalist way, until now I've always been more interested in war correspondents than in war participants. I'm not sure how much I want to know about war, especially now, and about the military, but all versions of history should be recorded and preserved, whether they're about amateurs, in a way, like Mrs. Berry, or professionals like the women of our Defence Forces. Every woman's story deserves a run, whether they're wearing slippers or flippers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kaz. Fantastic sort of meditation, really, but also a battle cry on many levels for a broader understanding of actually the experience of what war means and soldiering. I've had the privilege of interviewing veterans of the Afghanistan conflict over the last 6 or 7 months, including some women, but it's taken us 6 months to find those women, 2 women soldiers. One of them flew Chinook helicopter. They call them fat cows, apparently. Thanks, Kaz. It's really broadened our idea of what it means to experience war, I think, particularly with Mrs. Berry's perspective there. I want to invoke a final military metaphor. You can't help but kind of call them up, can you? You know, the rally call, all those sorts of things. And that's to suggest that Kaz Cook deserves the Military Cross for service to Australian women over the last 2 generations, for really shining the light so sharply and humorously and incisively on the question of sexism and gender. And women in Australia, I think it's been great. Thank you, Kaz. And sadly, that wraps up today. We hope we'll be on the History Week calendar as a fixture next year as well, so watch this space. And it's incumbent on me to thank a few people, particularly the Museum of Victoria, for their support and generosity in hosting us with this event here today. If you'd like to know more about the PHA, which the genesis of this event came out of, including our 4 wonderful speakers, you'll find some information, I think some pamphlets and brochures out on the table outside. Or it feels a bit like a military recruiting thing, doesn't it? But please take one and have a look. It's a really terrific organisation and very dynamic, as I said. So I've thanked the museum. I've got to thank Jackie Kerrin, and I'd also like to thank a large body of people who you haven't seen today on the stage from the PHA, without whom this event wouldn't have happened. You know who you are, and some of you may not even know who you are, but we need to thank you because in your own inimitable way you've contributed to this event. Lastly, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming along and for sharing this passion for history and for a very sort of public application of history. And it's made me think a lot, and I've come away with 4 extraordinary lives that I may not otherwise have known, and I'm glad I know about them. Thank you.